Our story left off on a Sunday night in 1971, the moment an American president closed the door on gold forever. To understand what had just broken, it helps to remember what it replaced. Back in 1944, representatives from 44 allied nations met at a mountain resort in New Hampshire to design the world's money system from scratch. The deal they struck was elegant and simple. Every other currency in the world would be fixed to the American dollar, and the dollar alone would be fixed to a set weight of gold. Alongside two new institutions built to help manage it, that arrangement kept the world's trade running on a foundation almost everyone trusted for nearly 25 years. For decades, that promise, dollars for gold on demand, had anchored the entire world's money. Now the anchor was gone. The question this left behind was almost too simple to ask out loud. If a dollar was no longer a promise of gold, what was it a promise of now? The world's finance ministers had 4 months to find an answer or invent one. In December of 1971, 10 of the world's richest nations gathered inside a museum in Washington to patch the system back together. They agreed to weaken the dollar and loosen the old fixed exchange rates without ever reopening the gold window itself. One official called it the greatest monetary agreement in the history of the world. It would not survive its own first birthday. Within a year, speculators were betting hard against the newly patched system, and central banks were drowning in dollars nobody quite wanted anymore. By February of 1973, the United States devalued the dollar again, and this time the patch simply gave way. Within a month, nearly every major currency in the world was floating freely, rising and falling against each other with no fixed anchor at all. The system built at Bretton Woods in 1944, the one this whole series keeps returning to, was now finally completely over. None of this made the evening news where it mattered most. At a small roadside filling station a family had run for 2 generations. The father filled a tank, made change, and never once thought about exchange rates in Washington. But a currency with no fixed anchor would eventually find its way into every gas tank, every grocery bag, every small business in the country. It would take one more shock from the other side of the world to make that connection impossible to ignore. That shock arrived in October of 1973, and it began, of all places, with a war. When war broke out in the Middle East that October, the Arab oil-producing nations reached for a weapon that had nothing to do with tanks or planes. They cut oil production and placed an embargo on nations that had supported the other side, the United States chief among them. In a matter of weeks, the price of oil did not rise gently. It nearly quadrupled. Back at the roadside station, the family watched their delivery truck arrive half empty for the first time in 20 years. Soon, lines of cars stretched down the block, waiting hours for gasoline that might run out before they reached the pump. Some states began rationing by license plate, odd numbers one day, even numbers the next. The family put up a sign of their own, 1 tank per car, and still ran dry most afternoons. Fuel oil for heating homes grew scarce too, and that winter, a strange new word entered everyday conversation: stagflation. Prices rising even as the economy slowed. In Washington, a very different kind of meeting was underway, one that would matter far more than any ration card. The nation's top diplomat, Henry Kissinger, began flying between capitals. In a style of diplomacy so relentless, reporters gave it its own name: shuttle diplomacy. His goal was not to force the price of oil back down. It was to make sure all that new oil money found its way back into the American financial system. That meant a quiet understanding with the most powerful oil producer of all, the desert kingdom of Saudi Arabia. In June of 1974, Kissinger and King Faisal announced a new economic partnership between their two nations: closer ties, shared investment, deepening cooperation. Later that same year, a quieter arrangement followed, one that stayed secret for more than 4 decades. The kingdom would keep investing its oil earnings into American government bonds. In exchange, it would receive military equipment and quiet security guarantees. The arrangement was not made public until 2016, when journalists uncovered it through a Freedom of Information request. It is worth being precise here, because a much bigger legend has grown up around this moment. Many retellings claim a single secret treaty forced every barrel of oil in the world to be priced only in American dollars. No historian has ever found that document because it does not appear to exist. What actually happened was smaller and slower, a web of financial and military ties that made the dollar useful, valuable, and hard to walk away from without ever needing a formal decree. Whatever the mechanism, the effect was real. Oil and the dollars used to buy it became the new gravity holding the currency in place, now that gold no longer could. Some retellings of this era go much further than a quiet financial arrangement. They claim the closing of the gold window and the flood of petrodollars that followed were not improvised crisis decisions at all, but a plan quietly steered for years by a small circle of powerful financiers, always positioned to profit no matter which way the system moved. There is a real thread of truth running through that story. One private New York bank worked especially hard to funnel Middle Eastern oil money back into its own vaults. That bank's chairman, David Rockefeller, welcomed the flood of petrodollars, and his institution helped shape the very system this episode has just described. That much is documented and verifiable. Whether it adds up to one small group secretly planning an entire decade in advance is a very different and far less certain claim. And this series will return to it at the end. Back at the station, none of this eased the weight at the pumps. The embargo lifted in the spring of 1974, but oil, and nearly everything else, never returned to its old price. The family had survived the embargo. What came next would prove much harder to survive. Because behind the scenes, the nation's money itself was quietly losing its footing. For most of the 1970s, one word haunted every economic conversation in America: inflation. At the Federal Reserve, the same cautious economist, Arthur Burns, who had quietly worried about the decision back in 1971, was still in charge. He faced enormous political pressure to keep interest rates low and the economy humming, even as prices kept climbing. One president even handed out small buttons that read simply, "Whip inflation now," and asked ordinary citizens to fight rising prices through sheer willpower. It did not work. Willpower alone cannot lower the price of gasoline or bread. At the station, the family's own ledger told the same story more plainly than any speech. Wages for their 2 employees needed raising almost every year now, just to keep pace with the cost of living. Suppliers raised their prices before the family could even raise their own. To keep the station running, and to finally renovate the aging diner counter, the family took out a business loan at what seemed, at the time, like a very ordinary interest rate. They had no way of knowing that within a few years, that ordinary rate would climb to something almost unimaginable. By the end of the decade, inflation in America was running close to 12% a year and still climbing. Foreign governments and investors were losing confidence in the dollar just as thoroughly as American families were losing patience with their grocery bills. Something had to change at the very top of the Federal Reserve, and in August of 1979, it did. A new man, Paul Volcker, was appointed to lead the institution, a towering figure both in reputation and, quite literally, in height. He was known for one blunt, unfashionable belief: that inflation could only be beaten by making borrowing painfully, deliberately expensive. Most politicians did not want to hear it. He was appointed anyway, because by then, the alternative felt even worse. At the station, the family had no idea a decision made in that room was about to reach all the way down to their monthly loan payment. The next chapter of this story is the one still taught in economics classrooms today, simply as the shock. In October of 1979, the Federal Reserve announced a completely new approach, one that let interest rates rise however high they needed to, with no ceiling in mind. Economists at the time called it the Saturday night special because of the surprise weekend announcement that caught markets completely off guard. Within months, the cost of borrowing money in America reached levels nobody alive had ever seen. At its most extreme, the rate banks charged each other briefly climbed above 20%. At the station, the family's loan payment nearly doubled overnight. They were far from alone. Farmers, home builders, and small business owners across the country faced the same impossible math all at once. Home construction nearly stopped in many towns. New car lots sat unsold under the summer sun. Unemployment climbed toward levels the country had not seen since the Great Depression itself. Frustrated citizens mailed the Federal Reserve Chairman house keys and short boards of lumber, blaming him personally for homes and businesses they could no longer afford to finish. He kept the policy in place anyway, convinced that any retreat now would only make the next round of inflation worse. At the station, the family cut back everywhere they could. Fewer new supplies, smaller staff, longer hours worked by the family themselves. They came within weeks of losing the station outright, the same business the father had grown up inside as a boy. A short extension from their local bank and a slower month than expected for the loan's payment schedule was the only thing that kept the doors open. Across the country, the pain was not evenly shared, and it was not without genuine, serious critics. Some economists argued the recession went further and lasted longer than it needed to, and that the human cost fell hardest on people who had no seat at the table where the decision was made. Others argued that any smaller, gentler version of the policy would have left inflation only partly tamed, ready to roar back within a few years. By 1983, inflation had fallen from well above 13% down to close to 3%. That summer, the Federal Reserve finally began easing the policy, a slow, cautious release of the pressure it had held for nearly 3 years. The recession that followed remains one of the most severe of the entire post-war era, but the inflation that had haunted the decade was, for the first time in years, genuinely broken. The shock did not stay contained inside America's borders either. Nations across Latin America had borrowed heavily in dollars during the cheap money years. When American interest rates suddenly tripled, their debts became nearly impossible to repay. Mexico came closest to default in 1982, an early tremor in what would become known across the region as a lost decade. Some point to this as proof the shock was aimed at developing nations all along. The more likely truth, most economists agree, is a domestic policy with a foreseeable but not deliberately intended cost dumped onto the rest of the world. At the station, business slowly returned to something like normal. New customers appeared at the pumps, and the diner counter filled again on weekend mornings. The father paid off the loan a full 2 years ahead of schedule, a detail he brought up, quietly proud, at every family dinner for years afterward. What the country had actually purchased, at enormous cost, was something that could not be weighed in gold at all: renewed confidence that the dollar's value would be defended, even if it hurt. That confidence, once nearly gone, became the new foundation the entire system would stand on for decades to come. So, after everything, gold windows closing, oil embargoes, a decade of rising prices, and years of deliberate economic pain, what actually gives a dollar its value today? It is not gold sitting in a vault somewhere waiting to be claimed. That promise ended in 1971, and it never came back. It is instead a small stack of overlapping promises. A government's legal power to demand that its own currency be accepted for every debt, public and private. A government's power to tax its citizens, which guarantees there will always be real demand for its own currency, year after year. And an independent central bank willing, as this episode just showed, to inflict real short-term pain to defend the currency's long-term worth. None of that is as simple or as tangible as a gold coin you could once hold in your hand. But simple and tangible is not quite the same thing as honest, and that is worth sitting with for a moment. Now, as always on this series, the part most retellings of this story tend to skip. Myth: the dollar today is backed by absolutely nothing at all. Fact: it is backed by something less tangible than gold, but not nothing: legal tender laws, tax obligations, and a central bank's hard-won credibility. Myth: a single secret treaty in 1974 permanently forced the entire world's oil to be priced only in American dollars. Fact: historians have found no such formal treaty. What they have found is a web of quieter military and financial arrangements that made the dollar useful without ever requiring one. Myth: a small, ongoing circle of financiers secretly planned this entire decade in advance, from the closing of the gold window to the flood of petrodollars, always positioned to win. Fact: the record instead shows real disagreement, improvisation, and crisis management among many competing officials and institutions. Individual bankers, like the one who eagerly recycled Middle Eastern oil money, undeniably shaped and profited from the system as it emerged. But no credible historian has found evidence of one coordinated master plan behind it all. Myth: the old gold standard years were a stable, golden age compared to the mess that followed. Fact: that earlier era had its own severe banking panics and depressions, some of which this very series has already told. Myth: the Volcker shock was a clean, uncontroversial success with no real victims. Fact: it caused one of the deepest recessions of the post-war era, and serious economists still debate whether a gentler path could have worked nearly as well. Myth: that same small circle deliberately aimed the shock at developing nations to trap them in debt. Fact: the policy was built to fight inflation at home. Its foreseeable ripple into Latin America's debt crisis is well documented, but pinning it on a hidden plan, rather than a domestic decision with global side effects, goes further than the evidence supports. Myth: none of this history actually touches ordinary people. It is just a story about officials and bankers. Fact: it reached one small roadside station and one ordinary family's dinner table, just as surely as it reached Washington. So which is it? Was cutting the dollar loose from gold a necessary evolution for a modern, growing economy? Or the moment honest money quietly died? Some economists argue a currency tied to a fixed amount of gold could never have grown fast enough to match a modern global economy, and that flexibility was the only realistic option left. Others argue that cutting the last tie to gold removed the only real discipline officials and central bankers ever had, and that the decades of debt and inflation since are the proof. Perhaps, as the series has said before, both things can be true at once: a genuinely necessary change and a genuinely costly one. What is certain is this: every dollar in your pocket today is not a claim on gold. It is a claim on trust, in a government, in an institution, and in a system that has already been tested and has already broken more than once. That trust has been rebuilt before. Whether it holds the next time it is truly tested is a question no single episode can answer. If you have followed this series from the beginning, you have now watched that trust get built, broken, and rebuilt across 2 centuries. A private dynasty's ledger, a secret meeting on a private island, a trading floor that fell silent for a decade, a veto, a printing press, and a television address. And now, a quiet agreement that ended the age of gold for good. If you enjoyed this one, subscribe for the rest of the series, and tell us in the comments, honestly, do you think today's money is still, in any meaningful sense, honest money? This series has always tried to tell the story first, and separate fact from legend after, rather than the other way around. That has meant naming real people, real decisions, and real consequences, while keeping the parts that are still genuinely disputed clearly marked as disputed. It has also meant remembering that every one of these decisions eventually reached somebody's kitchen table, not just somebody's boardroom. For education and entertainment only. This is not financial advice, just the story of how money actually became what it is today. Next time on Money and Power: Hidden History, we ask what happens when trust in the system breaks all over again, and a small group of strangers decide to build a currency that answers to no government at all.